Households across the UK are struggling with cost of living pressures, and energy costs are expected to skyrocket over the next few weeks.
There's no sugarcoating it. Energy bills this winter are going to be very grim.
The energy giant BP has just announced it's tripled its underlying profits after it benefited from soaring energy prices.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. It's still pretty warm outside here in London, but if you're watching or reading the news in the UK right now, it's all about the grim winter of discontent that's coming our way. Energy prices are soaring and they're only expected to get higher, which means that millions of people will be pushed into fuel poverty. Meanwhile, the energy companies are making record profits, which the United Nations and many, many others are calling immoral. And so on today's programme, we're going to be looking at why prices are so high and if they're likely to go up or down, and if there's going to be civil unrest or riots in the UK and beyond. We'll hear from our experts in a moment, but first a quick reminder of how we got here.
Prices are going up across the board.
Energy bills are going to go through the roof this winter.
I'm more concerned about the young people in particular, with families, how they're going to manage.
It's hard to believe now, but the UK used to be energy independent. In fact, thanks to its North Sea oil and gas development, it was able to be a net exporter of energy for all of the 80s and 90s, right the way up to 2004. Unfortunately for the UK, North Sea oil production peaked in 1999. The country also cut its use of coal dramatically over the past couple of decades. Consequently, by 2004, it became a net importer of energy, and it now needs to import roughly a third of all the energy it uses. And while the UK is still more energy independent than other major European economies like Germany, France, Italy and Spain, it still has to pay the price for not being self-reliant. If we include transport, this is what the UK's energy consumption and production looks like. Petroleum, aka crude oil in green, is still number one. Then natural gas, followed by renewables, and finally that tiny strip of blue, well, that represents coal. As we all know, oil prices have been shooting up, and consequently, so too have petrol prices at the pump. If we're talking just about how the UK's electricity is produced, the figures look quite different and much greener. Just over 40% of the UK's electricity comes from renewable sources, predominantly wind power, but also bioenergy, hydropower, and finally solar power. But a significant amount, 38%, still comes from natural gas, and as we all know, gas prices have been going through the roof recently, in large part because of Russia's attack on Ukraine, but also because of the jump in economic activity since the world started to emerge from the COVID lockdowns. And so, British consumers, like their counterparts in many, many other countries, are paying a lot more just to light and heat their homes, and it's only going to get worse. The UK's energy regulator Ofgem has just increased the energy price cap by 80%, meaning that suppliers can now hike their customers' bills by up to 80% to take into account the increased cost of buying and supplying to people's homes. Experts believe 2/3 of households in the UK, roughly 45 million people, will be pushed into fuel poverty by January 2023, meaning they'll be spending more than 10% of their net income on fuel. That means millions of people having to cut back on food and using electricity because they simply can't afford it. And for some, this winter will prove lethal. Close to 10,000 people die every year in Britain because they can't afford to heat their homes. And as things stand, there's every expectation this year will be worse still. All this at a time when energy companies are making record profits. ExxonMobil made $18 billion in the past 3 months. Shell and Chevron hit $12 billion. BP over $8 billion. Its biggest profit for 14 years and twice what it made in the same period a year ago. And it's not just companies doing well. Big energy exporting countries are also enjoying the bonanza. Russia's oil revenues are now actually higher than before it attacked Ukraine, while Gulf states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are expected to pocket a $1.3 trillion windfall over the next 4 years, according to the IMF. Prosperous times ahead for them, tougher times ahead for any country still importing energy. which is why politicians in Britain are promising to make the UK energy independent once more.
All right, we'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first let's take our weekly trip out of the studio to hear what Joe and Joanne Public think of the record prices and record profits.
I think it's disgusting, and the government needs to step in. They need to regulate these firms. I don't think nationalising them is the right thing, but I think they should definitely have some sort of mechanism where these energy companies, when the cost of living is rising, that they shouldn't, that their prices should be frozen.
They shouldn't be allowed to hold a position like that. I mean, I just don't know how they sleep at night. That's just such horrible behaviour. Oh, yeah. Ugh. Special place in hell.
It's mad. Their profits are rising, but they're not passing things on to the customers. No, we're the people that are making them have the money they've got. So why not be sensible about it and say, you know what, in the current climate, you know, we've had COVID, everything was in lockdown, money was tight, loads of people lost their jobs. Why don't we consider that and make things reasonable? You know, fuel prices are going up, gas, electric, water, food. What are they trying to do to us?
Well, that's what we're trying to find out on today's programme. So let's bring in our experts now. Patrick Boyle is a professor of finance at King's College London and has been on our programme many times. Johnbosco Nwogbo is the lead campaigner for We Own It, which favours nationalisation of some energy companies. We also have Andy Mayer, the energy analyst at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And finally, we have Adam Scorer from National Energy Action, one of the UK's leading charities tackling fuel poverty. Welcome to all four of you. If I may start with you, Patrick. Let's start at the root cause. Well, the problem is there are lots of root causes depending on which country you're in. But just take us through a few of them. Why energy prices are so high?
Well, essentially, energy prices are really high because Europe has moved to importing an awful lot of energy, and we have this situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But really, the truth is that this problem was occurring in advance of that as well. And some of it just is that there is more demand for oil and gas than there is production right now.
Right. But at the same time, the energy companies are making the headlines for having record profits. Now, why is it that they cannot be regulated in such a way so as they make adequate profits and consumers don't have to pay record prices?
Well, the oil industry is just a very cyclical industry. So 2 years ago, they were making massive losses and no one really had any sympathy for them. Right now, they are making profits simply because the product they sell is in high demand, and so they're earning a margin on that. But it's not such an unusual profit for them to be earning.
Yeah. Adam Scorer, I think you're going to say that something needs to be done, and it's the government that needs to do it.
Yes, that's right. I think the blame game isn't very useful. We know the global commodity pressures that have forced the retail price up. The finger I would point at actually is why we've been so slow and so half-hearted in our attempts to mitigate or lessen the impacts of these price rises, which we have to acknowledge have literally exploded our welfare benefits safety net, with people unable to afford the basic costs of keeping warm. We've been too slow to recognise the scale and the decisive nature of an intervention from government, and it's only government that can do it in the short term. But then what are the steps we need to take to make sure the regulation of energy in the UK is focused on affordability and the protections for the most vulnerable, and what we can do to challenge one of the really British kind of aspects of this, which is the lousy energy efficiency of our home, where it takes more to heat our homes, it costs more, and we lose that heat quickest.
Can we talk about fuel poverty? Because that's what you're concerned about. People come to your organisation and they ask for help, for tips and so on. Just define fuel poverty for us.
Well, the definition that we tend to use is if you have to spend 10% of your disposable income to afford a decent level of heat and power, you're in fuel poverty. So at the start of these recent price spikes in October 21, we had about 4.5 million households across the UK in fuel poverty. When Ofgem announces its price cap rise on Friday, we expect that to go up to 8.5 million households. And if what we expect to happen in January and April happens, then you're talking 10, 13 million households. It's really important, though, but that definition captures so many people now that we don't lose sight of the severity, the depth of the issue, as well as the breadth of the issue, where you have many people spending 50%, 60%, 70% of a very low income just on the basics of keeping warm. And the consequence of that is, of course, they will not do that.
I think
they will not keep themselves warm, and we have all the health and welfare implications that follow.
So you're talking about people making choices between whether they will heat and whether they will eat and so on. I mean, this is pretty...
Making people no choices. Let me just say, people have no choices to make anymore because they don't have the money to enable them to make expenditures.
And so that's why you'd want the government to step in. Now, others might argue that the government stepping in yet again after spending so much during COVID might be unaffordable. And we know that UK government debt is massive. It's around about 95% of the entire country's GDP. Now, the Institute for Government, the IFG, has estimated that if the government were to try to cover the UK's, British people's extra energy bills over the next year, it'd be something like $130 billion. Where is that money going to come from?
It's an extraordinary amount of money, so which is why an organisation like mine would argue for deep, targeted support for the most vulnerable, the people who are going to get hit hardest, rather than a universal provision to try and take to shoulder all the costs of the energy price rises for everybody. But whichever way you cut it, it's a huge amount of money. But, that's what the state is there for. In moments of extreme crisis like this, with its ability to borrow at the lowest rates that are achievable, is to step in and make sure that we avoid a crisis that has thousands of people dying, the NHS overwhelmed, the budgets of millions of its poorest citizens completely exploded, and energy companies going out of business with the energy market in freefall. It has no choice. It has to do it. It's all about how quickly it does it, how deeply it does it, and what the way of recovering the costs over the long term will be.
Patrick, do you think the UK government can afford such a bill? And if I may, just for a moment, bring in the example of Greece. Greece plans to cover 94% of household power price hikes in September. Anyway, can the British government afford that?
I mean, the British government, something kind of has to be done. It always becomes a thing where if the government picks up a tab, it essentially just means, the public pay taxes, so the public are picking up their own tab in the long run. But basically, it's government borrowing rather than individual borrowing. And high spending today just equals high taxes in the future. Spending basically equals
no such thing as a
tax.
free lunch, exactly. But would you advise that the government does deal with this crisis in that way? In other words, sort out the immediate crisis and pay for it later?
Well, something has to be done, and as was mentioned, it's the most vulnerable people that we have to worry about. Like maybe not everyone, maybe the highest income people have to choke it down, and the country needs to worry about the people who are either going without food or in freezing situations.
Do you think such a strategy would increase inflation?
Would it increase inflation? It's hard to say. I think giving the money to the poorest people, like in particular if it's subsidized fuel for the poorest people, basically that money is spent on fuel. It's not taken and spent on other goods and services. So it should be less inflationary than writing broad-based checks to all energy consumers in
Understood.
the country.
OK, well, look, we're looking at solutions, government stepping in, paying more money. Johnbosco, you have perhaps a more radical solution, and you're the lead campaigner at We Own It. Tell us.
Well, I would very much dispute that it's a quote-unquote radical solution. Our latest polling, which happens to be the biggest poll that has been done in Britain on the subject, found that 66% of the British public, including 63% of Conservatives, are in favour of taking the energy system into public ownership. Just on the question of the taxation that was just being discussed, Norway tasks the private companies that kind of exploit their natural resources at a level of 56%, a kind of a windfall tax, whereas Britain does it at a 5%. And part of that 5% is recouped by those companies in the form of rebates, tax rebates that they get from the government. If we raised it to the level that Norway is able to, and you could keep in mind, of course, that Norway is able to use the proceeds of that to kind of subsidize energy bills for people in Norway at the rate of 80% above a certain cap, we could invest a lot of that money in keeping prices, energy prices lower for people. And I think the real solution is in creating a system that allows us to take the profits in energy generation and distribution and reinvest that profit in energy supply, which is where a lot of this problem comes up at the moment.
We are going to pick up on that point with Andy Mayer in just a moment, but can you talk about the nationalisation of energy companies? Obviously, there are multiple stages along the way, from extracting the energy to distributing it and then supplying it. Where would you like to see nationalisation?
Well, I think that it's the question is very much that of where is it the most straightforward and easiest to carry out public ownership or nationalization, right? So it's a lot more straightforward to take the big five supply companies into public ownership. The Trade Union Congress recently carried out research that found that that would cost about £2.8 billion. And we know that Bulb, one of the bigger energy companies in Britain, having gone bust in November, the Office of Budget and Responsibility actually found that the British government would have to spend around £2.2 billion holding that company up. So it's not that outrageous to take the energy supplies into public ownership. Now, if you went further upstream, if you like, to the energy distributors, so we have regional distributors, and of course we have National Grid. National Grid, at the moment, if we took that section of our energy system into public ownership, we would save about £3.7 billion a year. And I think it is a lot more realistic, actually, to talk about taking those parts of our energy system into public ownership, because they were already in public ownership before the privatization of our energy system. Now, when you talk about energy production, which is where I think the vast amounts of profits are, when you talk about BP and Shell, that becomes a lot more complicated because these are multinational corporations. And while I would like to see them in public ownership as well, I fully recognize how complicated that could be. I do think, though, that the British government could do a lot more in creating its own publicly owned energy generation company. Just one quick fact there, that renewable energies in Britain in terms of generation are 50% publicly owned, but only 0.07% UK publicly owned. So countries across Europe, publicly owned companies own British renewable energy. That is pathetic.
Andy Mayer, let's discuss Johnbosco's plan there. I can see you shaking your head quite virulently at points. He's talking about nationalising distributors and suppliers. He'd even like to have a go at the producers, but it's a bit complicated because they're owned in a multinational structure. Good solution?
Terrible idea. So nationalisation is a solution to nothing, and the TUC's figures are pure fantasy. The Bulb nationalisation is the one example that we've got at the moment, and that was at 2 billion. People are now talking about it costing 4 billion, and the same executive team's in charge. So all that has happened is a badly run company that should have gone to the wall with the chief executive fired is now having all of its risks taken on by taxpayers. And in reality, it's taxpayers in the future, not just taxpayers now. So one of the problems with kicking the can down the road by, say, freezing energy prices is essentially asking your children and your grandchildren to allow us to continue using energy in the way we've always been using it. And what needs to happen at the moment is those price signals need to ensure that those who can afford to cut energy use, and I appreciate the issue about targeted welfare and agree with that, those people need to be producing energy, and we need to be getting the price down, not just pretending that we can live in the way we've been living at the moment. But nationalisation is a solution that doesn't make any sense. You have to buy out the energy companies first. You can't afford to do so, and that simply increases the cost of living problem in the short term.
Johnbosco, just a quick rebuttal.
Yeah, I think in terms of the response that he just gave does not necessarily answer the question of why we're not taxing the energy companies at a higher enough level to be able to subsidize energy bills for people right now. But in terms of buying out those companies, just taking together the profits of the national grid and energy distributors £3.7 billion over the last year. We would be able to pay back the cost of buying those pieces of infrastructure back from those companies in just 7.5 years. So it's not necessarily an kind of unrealistic solution to the problem. And I think one thing is really important for people at the moment, given the outcries around profits, is that people don't think that essential necessities that people need to live should be profited off of by private companies. And we cannot hold these companies accountable. If we wanted to do something about what's happening at the moment, we cry to the government, but the government doesn't have control. Private companies have control.
Essential things being profited off. Andy, come in.
Well, come on. I mean, if we look at the countries that try extensive nationalisation, which are generally run by communists or socialists, then what you end up with is food queues. This is not a strategy that makes any sense in the modern world, and I pity the poor people who live in Venezuela, for example, who have been experiencing the full horror of that kind of strategy writ large in their daily lives. If we talk about profits and taxes, what was said was not true. There are 3 windfall taxes on the North Sea that add up to about 65% now. There are some allowances that allow you to get some of that back for investing, but we are in a gas supply crisis. We want companies to be drilling gas out of the North Sea. We want them onshore fracking to make sure we're getting the best use of our domestic resources and not then importing it from countries around the world, including places like Venezuela, where propping up the government with such tax revenues is a very bad idea.
Patrick Boyle, just looking at Andy Mayor's solution there, one of them is to actually get energy independence by, for example, fracking, but basically extracting whatever you can and not relying or trying to move in too rapid a fashion towards renewable energy. What do you say to that?
Possibly the root of this problem is the demonization of the energy companies, where we all use all of this power and then try to pretend that we don't. And we sort of feel if we import it from Russia, it's somehow more environmentally friendly than if we extract it in our own countries. And if you look at the United States, you'll see that they've maybe doubled their energy production over the last decade, basically through technologies like fracking and so on. And the United States is one of the few countries that isn't experiencing the problems we're seeing right now. It was just announced, I think, this morning that Japan is going to look into reopening nuclear power in the country because they need more power as well. And the truth is that the world uses a lot of power. For our economies to be like they are right now, we need this energy. And so the truth is that the world needs to be more pragmatic and look at how we can get the kind of power that we need, rather than look at ways of sort of vilifying these companies. Like if you go to an energy company, which is what's happening right now, and ask them, why are you not producing more power, while equally telling them that we plan on shutting you down in 5 to 10 years, it's very unlikely that they're going to invest in any new wells, which might take 30 years in order to earn back the cost of drilling.
That's an interesting point, but Adam Scorer, I can see you're not happy with it. Come in.
Well, I think the question is, what problem are we trying to solve? I think, in opposition to Andy, I think the French would be very pleased that they had significant state ownership of EDF and were able to shoulder the burden. But of course, the French don't have to nationalise. They already had that national stake, so they don't get the cost and disruption of doing it. So I don't think nationalisation is the response to the crisis that we've got, even though I'm open to discussions on greater state involvement and direction of it. And similarly to fracking, the idea that fracking is a way out of this crisis is for the birds as well. The geology isn't certain, the timing is too long, and the returns aren't certain either. Focus on the challenge that we've got. The challenge that we've got is because of a range of global economic forces and the characteristics of the UK regulatory market, and the fact that 80% of us heat our homes with gas has leave us particularly exposed to a problem now. And the immediate exam question that we have is how we stop this becoming a social and economic catastrophe and keep it as a crisis that we have to work our way through.
People are saying that energy prices are going up, therefore inflation is going up, and therefore possibly interest rates will go up, people will get even poorer. And that ultimately we could see either civil unrest or governments being changed at the ballot box at the very least. Johnbosco Nwogbo, do you foresee people getting so fed up that they're actually prepared to go on the streets?
Well, we've seen campaigns in Britain at the moment, the Don't Pay UK campaign, for example, and to a slightly lesser extent, the Enough is Enough campaign, kind of rising up in response to the desperation that people feel. We know that over 100,000 people have already committed to not paying their bills. This is a desperate situation, and it requires bold solutions. And we think that the idea that public ownership of our energy is for the birds is slightly difficult to stomach in this kind of desperate moment when privatization has given us what we have. France is able to cut energy bills at the level that they're able to because they have more control of their system. And even the British government recently recognized that they need more control of the energy system by taking back a part of national grid into public ownership.
Thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.